Daniel stared at his phone, reading Stephanie's text for the third time. If you won't move in with me, then we're done. I can't date someone who's stuck in the past. They'd been together for 8 months, and Daniel thought everything was going perfectly. But last night's conversation had changed everything. I want to wait until marriage, Daniel had told her when she suggested they find an apartment together. It's important to me. Stephanie had laughed at first, thinking he was joking. When she realized he was serious, her expression shifted to something between confusion and annoyance. Daniel, we're both 26. This isn't high school. Adults don't wait for marriage anymore. I do, Daniel had said quietly. My faith is important to me. I believe in purity. Now, sitting in his car outside his office, Daniel faced a decision that felt impossible. He could call Stephanie, apologize, and compromise his values to save the relationship. Or he could stick to his convictions and lose the woman he thought he loved. His phone buzzed with another message from Stephanie. I'm giving you one more chance to be reasonable. Yes or no? Daniel's hands trembled as he typed his response. I'm sorry, but my answer hasn't changed. I respect your decision. Her final message came through. Then we're over. Don't contact me again. That evening, Daniel called his older brother Marcus, who'd been married for 5 years. I feel like an idiot, Daniel confessed. Maybe I'm being unrealistic. Maybe waiting is just setting myself up for failure in relationships. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Danny, do you remember what Dad used to say about building houses? That you can't rush the foundation, Daniel replied automatically. Exactly. What you're building, character, integrity, faithfulness, that's foundation work. It's not glamorous, and people might not understand it, but everything else depends on it. After hanging up, Daniel knelt beside his bed for the first time in weeks. God, he prayed, I hope I made the right choice. Right now it feels like choosing you meant losing everything else. Help me trust that your plan is better than mine. What he couldn't know was that his choice had set in motion a series of events that would lead him to discover what true love actually looked like. 2 weeks after the breakup, Daniel threw himself into work with the intensity of someone trying to avoid thinking. But avoiding thoughts about Stephanie proved impossible when she started dating his coworker, Ryan, just 10 days after their breakup. That afternoon, Daniel's boss, Michael, stopped by his desk. Good work on the Morrison account. The client loved your concepts. Michael studied him for a moment. You seem off lately. Everything all right? Daniel considered lying, but something about Michael's genuine concern made him tell the truth. Going through a rough breakup. I'm dealing with it. Sometimes doing something for others helps when we're going through tough times ourselves. My church is organizing a community service project this weekend. We're renovating a community center. Interested? Daniel's first instinct was to decline, but sitting alone in his apartment feeling sorry for himself wasn't appealing either. Sure, Daniel said. Why not? Saturday morning, Daniel arrived expecting to spend a few hours painting walls and avoiding conversation. Instead, he found himself working alongside people who genuinely seemed to enjoy serving others. His partner for the day was a woman named Grace, probably around his age, who was painting trim with meticulous attention to detail. First time volunteering with this group? Grace asked, not looking up from her work. Yeah, my boss invited me. You? I've been coming to these projects for about 2 years. There's something about creating something beautiful for people who need it that just fills you up, you know? Daniel watched Grace work, noticing how she took extra time to ensure clean lines and even coverage. She wasn't doing this for recognition or to check a box. She genuinely cared about doing excellent work for people she'd never meet. What do you do when you're not painting community centers? Daniel asked. I'm a nurse at the Children's Hospital downtown, and I teach Sunday school. Grace smiled. Not the most exciting life by most people's standards, but I love it. Something about Grace's contentment intrigued Daniel. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. She seemed comfortable with exactly who she was. As the day progressed, Daniel found himself working harder than he'd planned, inspired by the team's dedication. When they finished, the community center looked transformed. Same time next month? Michael asked as they cleaned up. Daniel surprised himself by nodding. Definitely. Driving home, Daniel realized he'd gone 6 hours without thinking about Stephanie once. For the first time since the breakup, he felt something other than regret. Over the next month, Daniel found himself looking forward to the community service projects more than anything else on his calendar. Grace had become a regular conversation partner during their volunteer hours. "So what made you start volunteering?" Grace asked one Saturday as they organized donated books at a local elementary school. Daniel hesitated. The honest answer involved explaining his breakup and his crisis of faith about his convictions. But something about Grace's straightforward manner made him want to be equally honest. "I went through a breakup recently," he said. "My girlfriend wanted us to move in together, and when I said I wanted to wait until marriage, she ended things. I was questioning whether my standards were realistic in today's world." Grace stopped sorting books and looked at him directly. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "I'm still figuring it out. But being here, meeting people who seem to share similar values without making a big deal about it, it's helping me realize I'm not as alone as I thought." "You're definitely not alone," Grace said matter-of-factly. "There are lots of us who believe some things are worth waiting for. Can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot. Do you ever worry that waiting will limit your dating options?" Grace considered the question seriously. "I used to. But then I realized that anyone who wouldn't respect my boundaries probably wasn't someone I'd want to spend my life with anyway. If someone can't wait, it usually means they're more interested in what they can get from you than in who you actually are." The insight hit Daniel like a revelation. Stephanie had been focused on what she wanted from their relationship, not on understanding why his convictions mattered to him. She'd never asked about his faith, his values, or his reasons for wanting to wait. "Plus," Grace added with a grin, "I figure if God has someone planned for me, He's not going to let me miss out because I chose to honor Him. Trust tends to work out better than compromise in the long run." As the weeks passed, Daniel began to see his breakup differently. Instead of viewing it as a loss, he started recognizing it as protection. Meanwhile, his friendship with Grace was growing into something Daniel hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly successful community project, the volunteer group went out for dinner. Daniel found himself sitting next to Grace, engaged in a conversation about their career aspirations and dreams for the future. "I've always wanted to travel to different countries and volunteer at hospitals," Grace was saying. "There's something about using your skills to serve people who have nothing that just seems like the best way to live." Daniel studied Grace's face as she spoke, noting the passion in her eyes and the genuine care in her voice. This was someone who'd built her life around serving others, not around what others could do for her. For the first time since his breakup, Daniel felt something stirring in his heart that had nothing to do with loneliness or rebound emotions. 3 months after meeting Grace, Daniel realized he was falling in love, not the desperate, anxious feeling he'd experienced with Stephanie, but something deeper and more stable. The revelation hit him during a conversation they'd had after volunteering at a homeless shelter. "I used to think love was about finding someone who met all your needs," Daniel had told Grace as they walked to their cars. "But watching you serve others, seeing how you care about people you barely know, it's making me realize love might be more about becoming the kind of person who can meet someone else's needs." Grace had smiled. "That's beautiful, Daniel. And it's very biblical, actually. The idea that love is about giving, not getting. Is that something you learned growing up in church?" Daniel asked. "Actually, I learned it the hard way," Grace said, her expression growing more serious. "I was engaged 2 years ago to someone who seemed perfect on paper. Good job, good looking, said all the right things about faith and commitment." Daniel felt a stab of something. Jealousy? Curiosity? But waited for her to continue. 3 months before our wedding, I discovered he'd been having an affair with a coworker. When I confronted him, he said it didn't mean anything, that he still wanted to marry me. "What did you do?" Daniel asked quietly. "I called off the engagement. Not because of the affair necessarily, but because of what his response revealed about how he viewed love and commitment. He thought he could separate physical intimacy from emotional faithfulness. Grace stopped walking and turned to face Daniel. That experience taught me that the person you choose to love is choosing who they want to become through loving you. I decided I wanted to choose someone who would choose to become more faithful, more giving, more like Christ through our relationship. Daniel felt something profound shift in his understanding. Grace hadn't just been waiting for marriage because of religious rules. She'd been waiting for someone whose character would grow through the discipline of waiting. Grace, Daniel said carefully, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I think I'm falling in love with you. Grace stopped walking entirely and studied Daniel's face. That doesn't sound presumptuous. It sounds wonderful, because I think I'm falling in love with you too. Really? Daniel felt his heart racing. Really? You've shown me what it looks like for someone to choose their values over their comfort. You've demonstrated kindness, consistency, and genuine care for others. Daniel stepped closer to Grace, taking her hands in his. I want to do this right. I want to honor God and honor you. I want our relationship to be built on the kind of foundation that can support a lifetime. That's exactly what I want too, Grace said softly. As they stood together under the streetlight, Daniel felt a peace he'd never experienced before. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Not desperate or demanding, but secure and generous. He thought about Stephanie's ultimatum months earlier and felt a wave of gratitude. Her impatience had protected him from settling for something that looked like love but lacked its substance. 6 months into their relationship, Daniel and Grace had established a rhythm that felt both natural and intentional. What impressed Daniel most was how Grace approached their relationship with thoughtfulness. I've been thinking about something, Grace said one evening as they walked through a local park. What does it look like to prepare for marriage while we're dating? I think it means learning to work through disagreements respectfully, Daniel said, and building habits that will serve us well later. Like choosing to serve each other even when it's inconvenient. Like being honest about our struggles instead of pretending to be perfect. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Grace began having intentional conversations about topics that many couples avoided until after engagement. They discussed their approaches to finances, their relationships with their families, their perspectives on raising children. What Daniel discovered was that these conversations actually brought them closer together rather than creating pressure. I love that we can talk about anything, Daniel told his brother Marcus during one of their regular phone calls. That's a good sign, Marcus replied. The best marriages are between people who are also best friends. Grace challenges me to think more deeply about everything, but she never makes me feel judged. She seems to genuinely believe I can become the man God wants me to be. And how do you feel about who she is? Daniel considered the question. I admire her. I respect her. When I watch her interact with kids at the hospital or serve at the shelter, I think, this is the kind of person I want to become. That's love, brother. Real love. When someone's character inspires you to grow. That weekend, Daniel and Grace were volunteering at a marriage retreat for young couples from their church. During a break, Grace turned to Daniel. Do you think we're approaching our relationship as an opportunity to become more like Christ? Daniel thought about how Grace's example had inspired him to volunteer more consistently, pray more regularly, and treat others with greater kindness. I think you've definitely made me more like Christ. I hope I've done the same for you. You have, Grace said simply. You've shown me what it looks like for someone to choose integrity, even when it costs them something they wanted. As the day progressed, Daniel felt a growing certainty about his future with Grace. This was the kind of love worth waiting for, love that made both people better, love that honored God. That evening, Daniel began planning something he'd never thought he'd be ready for at 27. It was time to start shopping for an engagement ring. 2 months later, Daniel was more nervous than he'd ever been in his life. The ring he'd chosen was hidden in his jacket pocket as they walked through the same park where they'd had their first conversation about preparing for marriage. They reached the bench where they'd sat during many previous conversations, and Daniel suggested they rest for a moment. Grace, Daniel began, turning to face her. A year ago, I thought my life was falling apart because someone I cared about couldn't accept my values. I felt like choosing purity meant choosing loneliness. Grace's expression grew more attentive as she sensed the significance of the moment. But God used that painful experience to prepare me for something beautiful I couldn't have imagined. He used it to bring me to you. Daniel reached into his pocket, his heart pounding as he pulled out the small velvet box. Grace, you've shown me what love actually looks like. Not demanding or selfish, but patient and generous. You've made me want to become the kind of man who deserves a woman of your character. Grace's eyes filled with tears as Daniel dropped to one knee. Grace Elizabeth Morrison, will you marry me? Through her tears, Grace nodded vigorously before finding her voice. Yes, of course, yes. As Daniel slipped the ring onto Grace's finger, she threw her arms around him, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously. I love you so much, Grace whispered. I love that you chose faithfulness over convenience. I love that you waited for God's best instead of settling for good enough. Grace, I want you to know something. The fact that you chose your convictions over a relationship that required you to compromise them, that's one of the things that made me fall in love with you. It showed me you were someone who could be trusted with my heart. Daniel felt a profound sense of completion. The choice that had felt like loss 18 months ago had led to gain beyond anything he could have imagined. God really does work all things together for good, Daniel said. He does, Grace agreed. Even the painful things, especially the painful things. 8 months later, Daniel stood at the altar watching Grace walk down the aisle toward him. When Pastor Wilson asked them to share their vows, Daniel's voice was steady with conviction. Grace, I promise to love you with the same faithfulness that Christ has shown me. I promise to choose you every day, not just when it's easy, but especially when it requires sacrifice. Grace's vows brought tears to Daniel's eyes. Daniel, I promise to support you in becoming the man God created you to be. I promise to trust you with my heart, because you've proven yourself trustworthy through your choices. When Pastor Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel felt a joy that seemed to fill every corner of his being. Their honeymoon was a revelation. The physical intimacy they'd waited for was beautiful, but it was enhanced by the emotional and spiritual intimacy they'd built during their courtship. I'm so glad we waited, Grace whispered on their second night as they watched the sunset from their hotel balcony. Me too, Daniel replied. This feels like the perfect beginning because we spent time building the perfect foundation. 6 months into marriage, Daniel ran into Ryan at a coffee shop. I heard you got married, Ryan said. Congratulations. Actually, Stephanie and I dated for about 6 months after you two broke up. It didn't work out. She was always comparing our relationship to what she'd had with you. Said you'd treated her better, been more thoughtful, more reliable. Daniel felt a wave of gratitude rather than vindication. I hope you both find what you're looking for. Actually, I've been thinking about what you said about waiting. At the time I thought it was old-fashioned, but now, I'm wondering if maybe old-fashioned might be better. That evening, Daniel shared the conversation with Grace as they prepared dinner together. It makes me sad for them, Grace said, but it also makes me grateful. We get to experience love the way God designed it. Secure, committed, built on trust rather than fear. A year later, Daniel and Grace were leading a small group for engaged couples at their church, helping other young people navigate the same challenges they'd faced. You give us hope, one young man told him. Everyone acts like waiting is impossible in today's world, but seeing your marriage makes us believe it's worth it. It's more than worth it, Daniel always replied. It's the difference between settling for something that looks like love and waiting for something that actually is love. As Daniel reflected on his journey, he understood that God hadn't just given him a wife when he chose purity. He'd given him a partner whose character had been refined through the same choices Daniel had made. The breakup that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning, the beginning of a love story built on the foundation of faithfulness, patience, and trust in God's perfect timing. Here's the most important question you'll ask yourself today. What are you willing to sacrifice temporarily for something eternally valuable? Are you building your relationships on the foundation of immediate gratification or lasting faithfulness? Take a moment right now to honestly evaluate whether your current choices are leading you toward the kind of love that lasts, or just the kind that feels good in the moment? What might God be protecting you from by asking you to wait? And what incredible blessing might he be preparing you for if you trust his timing?